Over the past 2 or 3 years, there have been many occasions when we have recognized anniversaries associated with particular events of the Second World War. None, however, has more significance than Operation Overlord, or D-Day as it has become known. This, of course, was the meticulously planned assault by the Allied forces, in which hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women, their equipment and millions of tons of supplies, delivered by land, sea and air, were launched against the German forces occupying Europe. June the 6th, 1944, will be especially remembered by the thousands from so many countries across the world who are united by the common bond that their loved ones sacrificed their lives in the name of freedom. By the people of occupied Europe who were liberated from the yoke of Nazi tyranny. By the embattled people of Great Britain who saw D-Day as a new dawn. And by all the Allied forces who fought so long and hard to achieve their ultimate goal. 50 years on, those of us who are old enough remember well the excitement and the anticipation of peace which came with the Allied invasion of Europe. But this was tempered by the sadness and cruelty of war, as the years of bitter conflict drew to an end. This film tells the story of D-Day, and I hope it will help to emphasize the value of an alliance of like-minded peoples in restoring and preserving peace, freedom, and justice.
Deutsche Jugend, nach einem Jahr kann ich euch hier wieder begrüßen. Ihr seid heute hier in dieser Muschel nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht.
As morning broke on Friday, September the 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler's tanks and Stukas thundered into Poland. And the British declaration of war seems inevitable. On the morning of Sunday the 3rd, Neville Chamberlain declares war on Germany.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government the final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Almost immediately, mothers and young children are evacuated from the cities to the country before the inevitable bombing raids.
Get in your shelter,
Air raid shelters are prepared, and 2.5 million Anderson shelters are constructed in back gardens. Every man, woman and child is issued a gas mask, 38 million in all. To impede the German bombers acquiring targets at night, the country was subjected to a blackout restriction. In the evening, every window is shaded by thick curtains or screens. Factory windows are painted black to prevent any light from escaping. Torches are banned and no car headlights are permitted. At night, wardens patrol the neighborhoods enforcing these regulations. Thousands of young men are conscripted into the services. Men not in occupations vital to the war effort could select either the Navy, Army, and Air Force. The Navy is the most popular and quickly reaches its quota. The Royal Air Force proves the second most popular choice, but the vast majority of men find themselves assigned to the Army. With so many men being conscripted, women were urgently needed to fulfill the roles traditionally held by men. Women soon became the largest part of the workforce, filling jobs in factories, offices, the armed forces, and other essential areas. As Germany threatens Western Europe, a British expeditionary force of over 300,000 men were trained and sent to France. As they left for the continent, their mood was one of confidence and determination. At home, rationing was introduced. At first, petrol is restricted, but as a result of Hitler's unlimited German U-boat attacks on merchant shipping, in January, the government ordered the rationing of all meats, sugar, fat and butter. The ration book becomes the nation's most valuable possession. On the 9th of April 1940, Germany invades Norway and Denmark. A British expeditionary force is sent to Norway to retake the ports. The soldiers proved to be ill-equipped and poorly trained for mountain and Arctic warfare. The Germans, largely thanks to their air power, forced the British troops from Norway. This defeat causes serious repercussions back in Britain. On the 10th of May, Neville Chamberlain is replaced as Prime Minister by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. During the early days of Churchill's leadership, Hitler launches a blitzkrieg through France, defeating the French armies and trapping the British expeditionary force on the beaches of Dunkirk. On the 27th of May 1940, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay ordered the evacuation of the troops from the beaches. From all over the south coast, a vast fleet of ships and small vessels, known as the Little Ships, set sail for France in hopes of bringing as much of the army home as possible. Over a period of 7 days, they managed to rescue over 340,000 men in Operation Dynamo. The British, suffering incalculable losses, were relieved and even delighted by the evacuation. But Churchill soon puts the triumph in perspective by saying it was a defeat, and wars are not won by evacuations. In June, France surrendered. Nazi Germany, with its ally Italy, held sway from Norway to the Pyrenees and the Polish-Soviet frontier. Britain alone opposed Hitler, despite the British Army being short of everything from trained manpower to weapons and ammunition. Indeed, a significant proportion of the defence of the British Isles and its territories fell to Australian, Canadian, Indian, New Zealand and South African troops. With Germany on the doorstep, the British government established the local defence volunteers, or Home Guard, Dad's Army. Initially, 225,000 men joined, but this soon swelled to 1.5 million. This dedicated army would defend the country and fight the Germans on their home ground if necessary. Hitler's persistence in the destruction of Britain continued. He orders that plans be made for its invasion. German long-range guns began shelling the Channel ports. But if his invasion plans were to succeed, he needed to destroy the Royal Air Force, Britain's last line of defence. The Battle of Britain clearly demonstrated to the population that the Germans were too close for comfort. Air battles raged in the skies of southern England from July to September. The 2,500 pilots of Fighter Command, made up of British, Commonwealth, Free French, Czech, Polish and American Eagle squadrons, fought bravely. Despite overwhelming odds, they managed to defeat the Luftwaffe. The proximity of the Germans brought a flurry of activity from the British people. Productivity soared. Spitfires and Hurricanes were manufactured in record numbers, despite the Luftwaffe's attempts to destroy the factories. The government called for the people to donate everything for the war effort, from pots, pans and kettles to tyres and iron fences. Everything that can be recycled is sacrificed for the cause. The defeat of the Luftwaffe in the skies over Britain caused Hitler to postpone his invasion. Churchill and his planners began looking towards a return to continental Europe. Although it was obvious that many years of war lay ahead, the seeds of eventual victory had been sown. The success of the RAF owed much to the fact that the Germans had changed their strategy from the destruction of the Fighter Command to the bombing of cities. At the height of the battle, stray German bombers had accidentally bombed London. In retaliation, the RAF bombed Berlin. That raid infuriated Hitler, causing him to target the cities and giving the RAF the breathing space it so desperately needed. The Blitz of London began on September the 7th, with hundreds of German bombers attacking the docks and the East End. The fires guided more bombers to their targets that night. Over 400 civilians were killed, and over 1,500 seriously injured. thousands became homeless. Hundreds of firefighters fought a desperate battle to stop the fires and rescue those buried beneath tons of rubble. For 57 consecutive nights, the bombing continued relentlessly. Since the homemade shelters never offered any real protection, and for those in the East End of London where shelters were scarce, this saturation bombing sent the population into the underground stations for safety. The King and Queen visited the areas worst hit to offer the people comfort and to boost morale. Indeed, after Buckingham Palace had been bombed, Queen Elizabeth said, "Now I feel I can look the people of the East End in the face." Other cities were targeted, and terror bombing continued throughout the country, with heavy damage being inflicted on Bristol, Bath, Southampton, Liverpool, York, Norwich, Canterbury, Birmingham, and Belfast. But the biggest outrage was the near destruction of Coventry with its beautiful cathedral. Over 11 hours of continual bombing reduced the city to a mound of smouldering rubble. The Brits continued for many more months, and on December the 29th, bombs once again struck London with a ferocious intensity. The city of London blazed, but miraculously, St. Paul's Cathedral survived. By the end of the Blitz, more than 40,000 people had died and 86,000 severely injured. 2 million houses had been destroyed or damaged. Britain has been dealt a bitter blow. Hitler's attack on Russia in the summer of 1941 was followed by Japan's attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th. Bringing the two countries into the war, Britain, no longer alone, became a base for the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. 3 days after the attack on the American fleet in Hawaii, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill and their chiefs of staff met at the Arcadia Conference in Washington, D.C. All agreed that the defeat of Germany was the priority, and plans to wear down the Axis were set in motion. Starting in 1942, Russia began pressing its allies to open the Second Front to relieve the pressure on the Soviet armies. However, Allied priorities at this time included keeping the Atlantic shipping lanes open, and therefore it took several years to respond. In early 1942, the build-up of American troops and equipment in Britain on a massive scale began. This operation, called Bolero, was the preliminary to an early invasion plan codenamed Sledgehammer. Sledgehammer was originally conceived as a possible small landing at Cherbourg in 1942, leading to an invasion of the Pas de Calais in 1943. The United States began to build up its armed forces immediately after the collapse of France, in anticipation of its involvement in the European theatre of war. America's war production tripled in 1941 and increased fourfold by 1943. The US outproduced Germany by 4-1 in tanks during the war and more than 2-1 in total munitions. In exchange for the weapons that the US would supply, Britain offered their own specialist weapons and provided a home base for thousands of troops.
Don't mess with Mr. In-Between.
Nothing quite prepared the British public for the scale of the American arrival. The first American troops to reach the UK landed at Belfast Harbour in January 1942. The Britain to which the GIs came was a gloomy and depressing country, and this had little to do with the weather. Most people were wary of foreigners, but accepted this army of friendly occupation with remarkably good grace. Most of these troops were stationed in rural areas like Cornwall and Scotland. This influx of Yanks with the local population at times caused friction, leading to quips about how the Americans were overfed, overpaid, oversexed, and over here. By July 1942, over 81,000 US troops and 182,000 tons of equipment were landed. The build-up had begun. In September 1942, the Allied bombing offensive against German-occupied Europe began. And the United States Army Air Force joined the campaign, carrying out daylight raids to complement those carried out by the RAF at night. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were the backbone of American air effort, while the Lancaster and the Halifax were the muscle of Bomber Command. The daylight raids caused heavy losses among the American aircraft. On the 14th of October 1943, 288 heavy bombers set out to attack the town of Schweinfurt in southern Germany in order to destroy the ball-bearing factories. The raid became a running battle across France and Germany, resulting in a loss of 60 American bombers. On August the 19th, 1942, Lord Louis Mountbatten's Combined Operations Organisation staged a full-scale raid on the port of Dieppe. The purpose of the operation was to test the coordination of a large-scale amphibious operation by putting infantry and armour ashore with fire support and air cover. The Canadian 2nd Division, along with 1,000 British troops and 50 American Rangers, took part. German resistance was fierce, and after 9 hours, the Allies were forced to retreat. Almost 1,000 soldiers died in the attack, and nearly 2,000 were left behind. Of the 6,100 men who went into Dieppe, only 2,500 returned to England. However, valuable lessons had been learned that would contribute to the successful planning for the real invasion. By 1943, the tide had turned against Germany, who had suffered defeats by the Russians at Stalingrad and the British at El Alamein. Though it had been proven that the Germans were no longer invincible, there was still a long way to go before they could be defeated. In May 1944, German-occupied Europe looked like this. The planning and organization of the largest operation in history, the invasion of what had become Fortress Europe, had to be meticulous to ensure even a reasonable chance of success. For this reason, the best military, political, and scientific brains had been gathered to do the job. The initial planning was under the direction of Major General Frederick Morgan, who'd been involved in the planning of the invasions of North Africa and of Sicily. In March 1943, he was appointed Chief of Staff to the yet unknown Supreme Allied Commander, Cossack. In December, at the Tehran-Cairo conference, Dwight D. Eisenhower was given the job of leading the invasion of the Allies into Europe. The invasion was codenamed Operation Overlord. Ike's first step was to gather around him a strong command team, based to a large extent on the successful team forged in the Mediterranean doing the fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, an expert on ground-to-air cooperation, was appointed Deputy SAC. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory was given command of the Allied Air Forces, and Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay of the naval forces for the invasion. General Sir Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty, was to command the ground troops. And Lieutenant General Omar Bradley and Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey were named commanders of the main invasion forces, the US 1st and British Canadian 2nd Armies respectively. Eisenhower's long-standing Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, remained in that post, with Morgan as his deputy. Eisenhower moved Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, to Bushy Park, in London's northwestern suburbs, then on to Southwick House near Portsmouth. The key questions for the newly assembled command were when and where. When was the date that all the men and material would be available and ready. The detailed timings to be determined by tides and meteorological conditions. Where was the most difficult. The chosen location would have to satisfy all the prerequisites for an amphibious landing and subsequent breakout. And also, it would have to surprise the Germans. Options as far north as Norway and as far south as Bordeaux were considered. Eventually, they were narrowed to a choice between the Pas de Calais, closest by sea and nearest to Germany, the more obvious choice, and the beaches of Normandy, a longer sea crossing and farther from the Reich, but less well defended, the less obvious choice. Throughout 1942 and 43, the whole coast of France between the Belgian frontier in the north and Brest in the south was photographed by high-flying Allied reconnaissance aircraft. These sorties provided high-quality images from which important details, the beaches, offshore rock formations and tidal currents, could be assessed. Later on, reconnaissance Mosquitoes, Spitfires and Mustangs, equipped with oblique cameras and operating at speeds of over 400 miles an hour, repeatedly flew missions at very low level along the French coast, monitoring German obstacles, gun positions, bunkers and pillboxes. As much information as possible had to be gathered not only on the enemy's defences, but also on the beaches and general lie of the land. An enormous intelligence-gathering organisation swung into action. The information was collated by the Inter-Services Topographical Unit at Oxford under Colonel Sam Bassett of the Royal Marines. It produced detailed, up-to-date maps of the entire coastline, Using the BBC, Bassett appealed to the public to send all their pre-war holiday snaps. He received 30,000 in the first post, some yielding amazingly detailed information. In France, agents were used to gather information. The first regular service forces to be involved were the combined operations piloted parties. These combat swimmers were landed on beaches by all manner of means, including midget submarines, to check the obstacles, the gradients, and their load-bearing capacity. This was critical in determining which would be suitable for both landing craft and tracked vehicles. Details of the obstacles were necessary to develop techniques for their clearance. Until early 1944, the fabled Atlantic Wall was largely a part of Hitler's imagination. It took the arrival of Rommel, the desert fox and Montgomery's old adversary in North Africa, to actually get things organized with a view to defeating the Allied invasion armies on the beaches. Rommel believed, unlike von Rundstedt, the German CNC in France, that invading armies must be kept on the beaches and destroyed there. Failure to do so would cost the Germans the campaign and ultimately the war. From his appointment in November 1943, Rommel worked tirelessly to bring the Atlantic Wall up to a standard where it could serve its purpose. He had all possible invasion beaches laced with obstacles to disrupt and damage the landing operations. Examples of these devices included the Czech hedgehogs, tetrahedra, and Belgian stakes, many of which were fitted with explosive charges to wreck the landing craft and use them to block the beaches. Inland, 6 million mines had been laid, a mere fraction of Rommel's desired 50 million, as well as obstacles such as dragon's teeth. To deter glider landings, potential glider landing zones were planted with poles up to 10 foot high, which would wreck a craft on landing. The whole scheme was known to both the French and Germans alike as Rommel's asparagus. These obstacles were covered by ground fire, ranging from machine guns to 155mm artillery pieces. Positions and emplacements were constructed to house the guns and the troops, whose weapons ranged out to 12 miles and were intended to blow an invasion fleet out of the sea. The eyes and ears of all this was the chain of coastal radar stations aimed at the seas and skies towards Britain. Manning the defences in the Normandy area were the 352nd and 716th German Infantry Divisions. In reserve, but close to the beaches, in keeping with Rommel's strategy, was the 21st Panzer Division in the area around Caen. Control of the other 4 Panzer Divisions near to the French coast was retained by the Supreme Headquarters, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, situated in Germany, a decisive handicap in the Normandy battle. Once the decision had been made to go for Normandy rather than the Pas de Calais, detailed planning began. Morgan and Montgomery produced a plan to put the Allied assault divisions from the Bay of the Seine onto the Normandy coast, largely between the Vire and Orne rivers. Airborne troops would be dropped during the night before to secure each flank. The US troops to the west would advance on Cherbourg in order to capture the port. The British and Canadians would capture Caen on D-Day, and that would then be used as a pivot for the Allied armies to swing east and advance towards Paris and Germany. Smooth execution was required, as well as a convincing deception to keep the enemy from knowing exactly where or when. The deception behind Operation Overlord was the most comprehensive in history. Its main aim was to ensure that the invading armies could maximize the element of surprise and prolong it for as long as possible. The key to the deception was to mislead the Nazis, and especially Hitler, as to the time and place of the real invasion, not a possible feint attack. Hitler and the High Command needed to be convinced that the real invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais in either May or July, August 1944. And that any other landings were merely a diversion designed to draw the enemy forces from the Allied army's main point of effort. Indeed, the deception went further than the Pas de Calais. In order to tie down as many German divisions as possible away from the real invasion front, actions were taken to convince the Nazis that the Allies were seriously considering launching the invasion in Norway, southern France, and the Balkans. The operation to keep Hitler's forces dispersed and to disrupt his response to the real invasion was codenamed Bodyguard. Within the strategic deception of Bodyguard were no less than 36 subordinate major plans and many more minor ones. Operation Fortitude was designed to conceal the secrets of the real invasion plans, especially the time and place. Fortitude North was designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would be launched on Norway and attack Germany through Sweden in concert with Russian forces. To support this deception, intensified intelligence gathering was directed at Norway, and an increased number of commando raids caused significant disruption to the production of raw materials and the transportation infrastructure. The most important element, however, was Fortitude South. This involved the creation, at least in the minds of the German High Command, of a fictitious army group aimed at the Pas de Calais. The army was the first US army group, FUSAG, and consisted of a number of teams broadcasting convincing radio traffic and producing hardware to fool visual reconnaissance from the air. To give FUSAG added authenticity, its commander was real enough. General George S. Patton, the firebrand American general who'd proved such a dynamic and controversial commander of US armored forces in North Africa and Sicily. Patton's activities were closely monitored by German intelligence. Control of the air was a vital prerequisite to the success of the operation. The Germans' eyes had to be blinded, while the Allies' aerial reconnaissance had to be top-notch. The Luftwaffe could not interfere with Allied operations. Close support was critical for the ground forces to destroy the enemy. Targets deep behind the enemy lines also had to be destroyed. The most important were concentrations of panzer divisions and the road and rail networks that could bring them to the front. As the date for D-Day drew closer, the bombing of German targets was to shift subtly. The priorities became transportation, troop movements, and support for the landings themselves. By day, United States Army Air Force fortresses and liberators carried out the attacks, followed by RAF Lancasters and Halifaxes continuing the process by night. Medium bombers then continued the process. These aircraft carried out daylight, low-level precision attacks. For close air support, the single-engine fighter bombers came into their own. The US AAF had the P-47 Thunderbolt, whilst the RAF had the Tempest and the Typhoon, rocket and cannon-firing aircraft that could operate from austere airstrips run by RAF servicing commandos close to the front line. They were used as train and tank busters. Operating the flying cab rank principle, they were summoned onto their targets by Air Force officers located with the forward ground troops. Less glamorous, but equally important, were the aircraft that would be used to tow the gliders and drop the paratroopers who were to secure the flanks of the invasion beaches. The DC-3 Dakota was the main paratroop aircraft, but Stirlings, Albemarles and Halifaxes were also used. The gliders were a variety of types that carried troops and heavier equipment. Often constructed by furniture companies, they were the Horsa, the Hadrian and the larger Hamilcar, capable of carrying bulldozers or light tanks. American, Canadian, Dutch, Norwegian, Free French and Polish, as well as British ships, landing craft and specialized vessels, took part in Operation Neptune, the Navy's role in overlord. It was mainly commanded and planned by the Royal Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. Neptune consisted of two distinct parts: the naval forces of 1,212 Allied warships that would escort and support the landings, and 4,125 amphibious craft, 735 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant ships that would actually land and support the troops. The D-Day invasion produced the largest fleet that was ever put to sea. A vast armada that filled every port, estuary and bay in the south of England and further afield. 70% of the warships were British or Canadian. The rest were from the US, Free French, Greek, Norwegian and Polish navies. The largest ships were the battleships like HMS Warspite and USS Texas with their 16-inch guns, ranging down to the destroyers that every navy contributed and which were the workhorses of the task forces. The key vessels of the whole operation were the various types of landing craft, and due to the demands of other theatres like the Pacific, they were not in abundant supply. The majority of these craft were designed to carry troops, landing craft assault and landing craft infantry, or fighting vehicles, landing craft tanks. However, there were fannies among these vessels, which supported the landings in other ways, such as the landing craft gun and the landing craft rocket. The Naval Task Force was subdivided into the US Navy's Western Task Force under Rear Admiral A.G. Kirk and the Eastern Task Force under Rear Admiral Sir Philip Vian. They would transport and support the American and British assaults respectively. Two major features of Operation Neptune were the Mulberry Harbour and Pluto. To avoid the necessity of capturing a port, the decision was made to build a floating one and take it across with the invasion forces. The Mulberry Harbour was a prefabricated structure of steel and concrete that was towed to the French coast and assembled there. Old ships would be sunk close by to form a breakwater. Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was laid on the seabed to allow fuel to be pumped to France from Britain. Y-Day, when all had to be ready to go, was set at the 1st of June, with D-Day, the day of the actual invasion, to be between the 4th and the 7th. That was the time when the tides and the moonlight were considered to be the most favourable. However, the weather was to be the critical factor in the decision of when to go, and that decision had to be made early. For the ships to cross the channel, it meant that once loaded, they would either have to go or wait off the English coast, vulnerable to German aerial reconnaissance and attack from the sea. The wrong weather could produce rough seas and high winds, which would prove disastrous for both the amphibious and the airborne landings. The key men in the decision of when to go became the weather forecasters. Vast Allied resources have been dedicated to both ensuring that the best meteorological information was available to them and denying it to the enemy. From May, weather patterns have been tracked eastward from Newfoundland. The man in charge of the Allied weather was Group Captain Stagg of the RAF. The deputy was Colonel D.N. Yates of the USAF. The primary date for the invasion was the 5th of June. But the incoming weather was so bad that Stagg advised postponement to Eisenhower, who duly made that decision. The weather looked little better over the next few days. Indeed, the Luftwaffe's weather service had stated that conditions would rule out invasion operations for at least several more days. On the 4th of June, at 4 a.m., in Eisenhower's HQ at Southwick House, Stagg was called upon to make the greatest decision of his life. He advised the Supreme Commander that, though far from perfect, there would be an abatement of the bad weather on the 6th of June that could allow the landings to proceed. At 04:15 on the 5th of June, Eisenhower gave the order to go. Rommel, meanwhile, had been advised by his weather experts that an attack would be almost impossible. Accordingly, he decided to go to see Hitler on the 5th of June to plead for control of the other panzer divisions and to be with his wife on her birthday, an added bonus to the Allies. Shortly after midnight on the 5th of June, the first advance force operations began. British SAS teams were dropped into France to coordinate resistance operations and to conduct deception operations. Off the beaches, two British midget submarines, the X-20 and the X-23, would surface and mark the run-in for the assaulting landing craft. COPS teams had already neutralized some of the beached obstacles, and farther afield, other deception operations took place. Messages to the French resistance had activated many groups who would carry out sabotage attacks to hinder the enemy reaction. Simultaneously, operations were taking place in the Pas de Calais to convince the Germans that landings were on their way there. A flotilla of small ships mounting radar reflectors sailed to those beaches, and 30 British and American bombers dropped strips of window, radar reflective foil, to indicate to the German radar stations that had been left intact by Allied air attacks that the invasion was on its way there. The first invasion forces to land on French soil were from the British and American airborne divisions. Their critical tasks were to secure the flanks of the landings as well as to capture or destroy strategic targets. In the west, the US 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions landed at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, with a task of capturing key points and securing the exits from the westernmost invasion beach, codenamed Utah. Anti-aircraft fire dispersed the drops badly, and many paratroopers were drowned in the areas of low-lying marsh that had been flooded by the Germans. Nevertheless, small groups of paratroopers got together and fought their way to their objectives, attacking what enemy they could find. The village of Saint-Mère-Église became a focal point for the 82nd Airborne Division. Some 30 troops were even dropped onto the village, which was ablaze in many places, and one man, PFC John Steele, actually landed on the church, dangling from his parachute, which was caught on the steeple, the church bell ringing furiously. The scattered drop for the 101st over an area 25 by 15 miles actually helped the Allied effort, in that the Germans could not determine a focal point for a counterattack. The dropping of dummies with firecrackers to simulate ground fire increased the Germans' confusion. Throughout the night, small groups of airborne troops, often from completely different units, grouped together and attacked what German forces they could find. The commander of the 101st, Major General Maxwell Taylor, struggled all night to bring his division together, but to little avail. By dawn it mustered 1,100 out of 6,600, rising to 2,500 by the evening. The 82nd had fared a little better. Fortunately, one of his regiments had been dropped almost according to plan. The remainder suffered the same fate as the 101st. The division had dropped on the edge of the German 91st Division's concentration area. It was that division which had been specially trained in counterattacks against airborne troops, and it formed the Germans' main reserve in the Cotentin Peninsula. However, its commander had been ambushed and killed by American paratroopers during the night as he drove to his HQ. Thus, at a critical time, the key German formation in the area was leaderless. The one concentrated grouping of the 82nd was to the northwest of Saint-Mère-Église. Well before dawn, 360 men of a 505 Para-Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Krauss assaulted the town. The element of surprise paid off, and Saint-Mère-Église could claim to be the first French town liberated by the Allies. Fragmented actions continued throughout the night and the following day through the hedgerows and lanes of the area. Though the airborne troops had been unable to physically secure the exits from Utah Beach, the chaos that they inflicted upon the Germans prevented them from mounting any effective action to reinforce their defences or mount counterattacks against the invaders. In the east, the British 6th Airborne Division under Major General Richard Windy Gale was a little luckier. As well as securing the left flank of the invasion, it had three other specific tasks: to silence the artillery battery at Merville, to destroy the bridges across the River Dive to the east, and to capture the bridges across the Orne and the Caen Canal intact. Brigadier James Hill, the commander of the 3rd Parachute Brigade, had warned his men, "Do not be daunted if chaos reigns. It undoubtedly will." His prediction applied equally to both the British and American airborne operations. However, though the weather was poor and the winds gusty, the British fared better during the landing phase than their American counterparts. The Pathfinders were reasonably successful in finding and marking the correct drop zones. At about the same time as the Pathfinders jumped, the 6 Horsa gliders, carrying the men of Major John Howard's D Company, the 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, landed beside the Orne and Caen Canal Bridge. The lead aircraft, flown by Sergeant Jim Woolworth, landed within 50 feet of the target. Many consider this night flight to be the finest piece of airmanship in the whole war. After a brief battle, during which Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, the assault platoon commander, was killed, both bridges were taken intact. The canal bridge was renamed Pegasus Bridge, and the adjacent Café Gondry became the first building in France to be liberated. Farther north, the 9th Parachute Battalion had the task of silencing the Merville battery to prevent it firing on the invasion beaches. The drop was chaotic, and just over 150 men with 1 Vickers machine gun attacked the 4 casements. Over a third of the attacking force were killed or wounded, and when the guns were checked, they were found to be medium field howitzers. The larger 155mm guns had yet to be delivered. Nevertheless, they did not hinder the landings on D-Day. To the east, the Dives bridges had been destroyed by the Canadian and British parachute battalions. The most dramatic was the destruction of the bridge at Troan by Major Tim Roseveare and a party of engineers, driving through German-held territory in a jeep and trailer loaded with explosives. Sapapici lying on the trailer as rear gunner, firing at any Germans around. He eventually fell off and was captured, but the party got to the Troan Bridge and destroyed it. Meanwhile, the bulk of the 6th Airborne Division made for the high ground of the Bois de Bavon and dug in to secure the eastern flank of the invasion and await the inevitable German counterattack. Because of the schedule of the tides along the Bay of the Seine, H-hour, the time when the first troops would land ashore, varied by 1.5 hours across the length of the invasion beaches. The westernmost beach, Utah, had the earliest H-hour. At 06:30, the men of the 8th Infantry Regiment of the 4th U.S. Infantry Division landed. The 1st Battalion to the right on Green Beach and the 2nd Battalion to the left on Red Beach. 30 men to each landing craft in waves of 20. The Deputy Commander of the 4th Division, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., landed with the first wave, and his presence was significant to the success on Utah Beach. On landing, his words were, "We'll start the war right here." Supporting them were 2 companies of the 70th Tank Battalion in their Shermans, 28 of which had been waterproofed in order to swim from 3,000 yards out from the beach by a modification known as Duplex Drive, or DD. The scene was a nightmare. The water was choppy. The beaches and their rear areas were being blasted by rockets, naval gunfire and bombers to such an extent that it was almost invisible behind a pall of sand, smoke and dust. In return, German shells were bursting among the approaching landing craft and DD tanks. The second wave was starting their trip to the beach when 276 aircraft of the US 9th Air Force attacked the beach defenses, delivering 4,400 250-pound bombs upon 7 designated targets. The first wave of assaulting troops were disembarked from their landing craft 300 yards out. With rifles held high, they waded and struggled to the dry sand of the beach and became the first amphibious troops ashore in France. The landings did not take place on the planned beaches. The tide had effectively shifted the landing beaches over a mile south. By 08:30, the leading assault troops had moved off the beach. By 10 o'clock, the 12th and 22nd Infantry Regiments were ashore and 6 battalions were starting to move inland. The German response had largely been ineffective and consisted mainly of sporadic artillery fire. The airborne troops of the 82nd and the 101st were to thank for the creation of confusion and indecision among the Germans. The 4th Infantry Division's casualties totaled less than 20 dead and 200 wounded, far lower than anyone dared hope for. The actions on and behind Utah Beach went as close to plan as anyone could hope for. The troops were able to fight their way inland with relative ease to link up with the scattered airborne troops and consolidate the west end of the beachhead before the advance of the Cotentin Peninsula. For the troops on Utah, the greatest difficulty had been the forces of nature. Omaha was a completely different story. The beach was over 12 miles east of Utah and the other side of the Vire estuary. It was defended by the German 352nd Infantry Division, and, different to Utah, there were no airborne troops to disrupt the defense. The German-prepared defenses at Omaha were far more effective than those on Utah. The currents were strong, and the natural lie of the beach favored its defenders. Between the outcrops and straight inland was a more gentle slope, with pillboxes and gun emplacements that covered the beach and its exits by crossfire. Between the low and high water mark were mines and obstacles aimed at landing craft, tanks, and soldiers on foot. The arrival of the German 352nd Infantry Division significantly increased the strength of the defence. The formation that was to assault Omaha was the Big Red One, the US 1st Infantry Division, which had seen active service in the Mediterranean. It was the only division out of the 11 US divisions in England that had been under fire. Accordingly, Bradley made the hard decision and assigned it to be the lead division onto Omaha. So at 0300 on the 6th of June, Force O, commanded by Rear Admiral Hall, the US Navy, started putting its assault craft into the water 12 miles offshore. The night was dark and windy and the sea choppy. A swell of 6 feet made life in the assault craft wet and miserable. Many of the troops had been seasick during the crossing and were not at their physical best on that fateful morning. Some landing craft sank in those first minutes, pitching their human cargoes into the heavy seas. Unfortunately, one tank landing craft launched 29 D.D. Shermans 6,000 yards out from the beach. In those heavy seas, 27 sank within minutes, and only 2, by hard work and good fortune, made it in. The 5-mile stretch of beach had been subdivided into 4 smaller assault beaches, from west to east: Charlie, Dog, Easy, and Fox. 40 minutes before the first troops landed, the naval bombardment began. Guns ranging from the massive 16-inch of the battleships to the 5-inch of the destroyers fired upon the coastal defences. These guns were supplemented by rockets from rocket-firing landing craft, most of which, unfortunately, fell short. In the air, a force of 446 liberators attacked 13 targets in the area of the beach with over 1,000 tons of bombs. Many of these bombs overshot their targets, as the bombardiers worried about hitting their own troops. As the assault craft were 800 yards out from the beach, the barrage lifted, leaving only the close support weapons of the landing craft to continue firing towards the defences. The Germans reacted. Shells, mortar bombs and machine gun fire started to hammer into the approaching craft. Many were hit and then hammered again as they lay dead in the water. The tides were no help. As they grounded on the sandbanks, many craft were slewed sideways onto the beach, making disembarkation difficult. Troops were in the water up to their knees, waists and necks, and a murderous fire all the time. They waded ashore in small groups onto the long, unopened expanse of sand. The scene was one of the carnage of battle. Dead and wounded men, mangled landing craft and vehicles, some ablaze. The 743rd Tank Battalion overcame great difficulties to get 8 Shermans ashore and engage the strong point at Vierville. By 0700, over 1,000 men were scattered across the beaches, often leaderless and in loose groupings of men from different units who joined together. Of the 16 engineer obstacle clearance teams, there were soon only 5, supported by a few bulldozers, actually able to clear any of the obstacles. For the 116th Regimental Combat Team on Dog Beach, 2 gaps were cleared. Farther east on Easy and Fox, 4 gaps were cleared. By 10 o'clock, the assaulting troops were still stuck on the beach, and the tide was moving in. The beach was getting smaller. Further waves of the landings had continued the build-up of troops and equipment on the beach, adding to the chaos and confusion. The word was sent back to the ships to land only men, no more vehicles. The fear of mines was uppermost in many men's minds. Gradually, order prevailed. Destroyers moved close inshore to bombard the German strongpoints. Individual leaders roused their men by personal example, and it was generally the follow-up companies that began the assault inland. The lead assault companies had been cut to pieces and were unable to take any further part in the assault. Colonel Taylor of the 60th Infantry exhorted the men on the beach by telling them that there were two kinds of men on that beach: the dead and those that are going to die. Now, let's get the hell out of here. Brigadier General Cotter of the 29th Division rallied his men with the call, "They're murdering us here. Let's move inland and get murdered." Gradually, as the day wore on, the balance tipped in favor of the Americans. By the evening, the battle had been won and the defences breached. However, the cost had been high, and bloody Omaha became the beach that cost the Allies the dearest in lives. The British and Canadian invasion beaches from west to east were Gold, Juno, and Sword. Gold Beach was a gentle slope, consisting of clay as well as sand. Strong points had been made of the villages of Arromanches, Le Hamel, and La Rivière. The beach had been subdivided into Howe, Item, Jig, and King, and was the objective of the 50th Northumbrian Division, a division that had fought at Dunkirk, North Africa, and Sicily. At 07:25, the landing craft carrying the tanks of the Westminster Dragoons and 81 and 82nd Assault Squadrons Royal Engineers started to unload their tanks and specialist fighting vehicles. Under constant fire from the coastal defences, a number of landing craft and tanks were lost. The remainder pressed on, and within an hour had cleared 4 out of the 6 planned safe lanes and was spearheading the leading battalions to their objectives. These tanks were primarily the Funnies of Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armoured Division. The petard tanks, modified Churchills, were particularly useful in destroying strong points with their huge demolition guns. The flail tanks, usually Shermans, then cleared a safe lane through the mines and obstacles. These would be followed by tanks laying fascines, bridging or trackway to allow the DD tanks, which had been ashore first and covering the rest, to advance through the breach with supporting infantry. The 2 lead assault brigades of the 50th Division were the 231st and the 69th. On the right flank, men from the Hampshire Regiment and the 1st Dorsets fought their way up the beach, supported by artillery firing from close support landing craft. There were not enough safe lanes cleared to assault through. Major D.J. Warren took command of the Hampshires after their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Smith, was wounded, and second in command, Major Martin, killed. They moved round to a flank and took Les Roquettes and Arsenal-sur-Mer, then moved to attack the strong point that the Germans had created in the Le Hamel Sanatorium. The Dorsets, in the meantime, supported by tank fire, took the high ground to the south of Arromanches. On the left, with the 69th Brigade, the Green Howards and the East Yorkshires fought their way through La Rivière and broke through the German defence line of strong points and pillboxes. It was for dealing with such a pillbox, among other valiant actions, that Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards was awarded the only Victoria Cross to be given for the 6th of June. By 11 o'clock, the follow-up brigades, 56th and 151st, maintaining the momentum of the attack, were moving inland through 7 clear lanes supported by tanks. They moved south and hooked slightly west to broaden the beachhead and to gain the high ground to the east of Bayeux. 47 Royal Marine Commando had landed on the extreme right flank, and its task was to capture Port-en-Bassin. They had lost 4 out of their 14 landing craft, but on landing advanced 10 miles west to capture the high ground to the south of the town. Quite a feat, as each man was laden with 80 to 90 pounds of equipment. The centre beach, Juno, was the objective of the 3rd Canadian Division. It had been subdivided into Love, Mike and Man. On the right were the 7th Brigade, on the left the 8th, with the 9th following up. The 7th Brigade assault was led by the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifles, with D.D. Shermans from the 1st Canadian Hussars. They landed a little later than the troops on Gold, but were determined to catch up. By then, the tide had reduced the expanse of beach to be crossed to 100 yards in places. The 8th Brigade assault was led by the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the North Shore Regiment. The assaulting forces faced heavy fire from the German defences as they fought their way to the top of the beach. Landing craft were hard hit by both defensive fire and obstacles. The larger craft attempted to ram their way through, while the smaller ones tried to weave their way around. At one stage, 20 out of 24 landing craft were destroyed, and the survivors struggled ashore. However, the build-up of troops continued, and once ashore, they didn't wait around. While naval obstacle clearance teams worked to clear the beach obstacles, the Canadian troops fought doggedly their way inland, destroying all the German resistance they could find. When the second wave came in, carrying among others the Regiment de la Chaudière, there was little opposition. The tanks and infantry were then grouped for the advance inland. Flails cleared lanes for the obstacles, and petards blasted gaps to the 12-foot sea wall. 12 lanes were cleared by the 79th Division tanks on Juno to allow a rapid advance southwards and movements to the flanking beaches. By midday, the Canadian 2nd Armoured Brigade was coordinating the armoured advance, and by the evening, the 7th Canadian Brigade was probing towards the lateral Caen-Bayeux Road, challenging the 69th Brigade of 50 Division from Gold for the lead. In the meantime, the 9th Canadian Brigade, the follow-up brigade, had taken the Corsair-Caen Road at its axis and began advancing towards the city as quickly as it could. By midnight, it would be within 3 miles of the outskirts of Caen. To the east, the 3rd British Division's objective was Sword Beach, between Saint-Aubin and Ouistreham. It had been subdivided into Peter, Queen and Roger from west to east. The 8th, 9th, 185th Infantry Brigades and the 22nd Armoured Brigade were the assaulting troops. Force S, commanded by Rear Admiral Arthur Talbot, was the naval force that delivered the division onto Sword Beach. To mask the left flank from the Le Havre batteries to the east, a large smoke screen was laid. Force S suffered an attack from German E-boats, which sorted from Le Havre to fire 4 torpedoes, one of which sank the Norwegian destroyer Svena. The remainder missed. H-hour was 07:30, with the tanks due to land 5 minutes before. The D.D. Shermans of the 13th, 18th Hussars had been put into the water 3 miles out. 7 out of the 40 were lost to either enemy fire or were swamped by larger craft moving too close. The naval bombardment was effective in spite of some rockets falling short, and the D.D. tanks arrived on the beach at about the same time as the Funnies of the 79th Armoured Division. They immediately started to breach obstacles and engage enemy strongpoints. The 8th Brigade fought towards Ouistreham with the 1st Battalion of the South Lancashire Regiment and the 2nd Battalion, the East Yorkshire Regiment. Casualties were heaviest among the assaulting troops charged with breaching the obstacles. In some areas, They were as much as 50% of the armoured vehicles and 20% of the troops. But a near orderly move inland was accomplished. The key road was the one from Hermanville through Beerville to Caen. By the time it had passed through Hermanville, the 8th Brigade dug in to consolidate, and the 185th Brigade prepared to open the road south. The volume of traffic trying to leave the beach prevented some of the armour from staying with its assaulting infantry. Consequently, the King's Shropshire Light Infantry fought their way to Beerville alone, linking up with the armour of the Staffordshire Yeomanry in their last approaches to the town. At Beerville, a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division with 24 tanks counterattacked. The Shropshires knocked out 5 German tanks and continued to advance. However, the Germans along the Libusy Ridge halted the British advance, inflicting serious casualties and clearly demonstrating that their defences would not be overcome by a quick advance, but only by a slower, deliberate attack. The Germans counterattacked with 50 tanks of the 21st Panzer Division launched at 1900 hours into the gap which still existed between Gold and Sword beaches. Fortunately, the attack was held in check and finally faltered as the last glider lift of the 6th Airborne Division flew overhead in the gathering dusk. The chances of the 3rd Division getting to Caen by D+1 had all but faded away. On the flanks of Sword, the 1st and 4th Special Service Brigades had landed their commandos, who were only lightly equipped and couldn't halt the German counterattacks to the west. To the east, the Free French Commando, under Commandant Kiefer, fought through the seafront of Ouistreham, having a major battle to capture the casino and other key buildings. Lord Lovat's 4th Commando quickly advanced inland to link up with the airborne troops of Bonneville and Pegasus Bridge. Led by Piper Bill Millen, playing his pipes, they crossed the bridges and went on to reinforce the perimeter that had been held by the 6th Airborne Division. By the end of D-Day, though the Allies had not advanced as far as planned and Caen remained in German hands, the invading forces were ashore with a firm foothold. Rommel had forecast that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be critical. His absence, and the fact that the 4 key panzer divisions were not released by the German High Command to quickly counterattack the invading forces at their most vulnerable moments, had allowed the Allies to consolidate, build up their logistics, and prepare for their subsequent advance from a firm footing. Allied control of the air would make German movement of their armoured forces very difficult, and though the Battle of the Hedgerows through the Bocage country of Calvados had yet to be fought, the advantage now lay with the Allies. The Germans had been convinced that a principal objective of any Allied invasion would be to capture a port within the first few days. They hadn't reckoned with the ingenuity of the Mulberry Harbour, which the Allies brought with them and positioned off the beaches, so negating the requirement to seize a port intact. At the end of D-Day, the cost of the operation in Allied lives was 2,500, 1,000 of them on Omaha Beach. Though enormous, it was a far lighter sum than the planners had been prepared to accept for the successful completion of an operation of this magnitude. Though the operation had been a success, it was played down at home in order to keep Hitler guessing that perhaps it was only a feint and that the real invasion would be at the Pas de Calais after all. Within a few days, it was obvious that this was not the case, but by then the Germans had missed the opportunity to knock the Allies back into the sea. The Allies now had their firm foothold in Europe, and though it would be another 11 months before Nazi Germany was finally defeated, die had been cast.